The reward for Cooper's curiosity took the shape of a long white cloud on the horizon. One of the last lands on Earth to be found was waiting for those curious few. And the curious ones still come. They met with Manakitanga, with open hearts, minds and arms. We share the taonga of this land, sea and sky. The path might not be paved. You might need to ask around, but it's here to find.
Good morning. Welcome to Storytime with Grandma. Every country has a national animal. Every country has a national flag. Every country has a national tree. But does every country have a national wire? Well, New Zealand does. The number 8 wire. A wire so important to New Zealand's pioneering story that it has entered the national lexicon, a byword for Kiwi ingenuity, the number 8 wire way. The number 8 wire, which really is just a length of 4mm gauge wire, is nothing particularly special in its own right. It is just your typical DIY wire that you might pick up from a hardware store, and that's exactly the point. New Zealanders have turned to this entirely ordinary length of metal wire for all manner of ingenious creative solutions. So much so that it is now a badge of honor. New Zealand's enthusiastic relationship with the number 8 wire dates back to the 1880s, when, thanks to the island's extreme remoteness from the rest of the world, settlers had to be resourceful with what they had rather than calling back to London for supplies. Everything ended up being held together with number 8 wire. So it should perhaps be no surprise that this small nation, 900 miles from anything, had the highest number of patent applications per capita of anywhere in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. A century later, and New Zealand is still in the top 5 countries for innovation. Innovation and a pioneering spirit seem to pump through the veins of New Zealand's islanders. And today, we're going to explore some of the greatest achievements to come out of New Zealand over the last century and get to know the people that made it happen. Let's start with adventure, and perhaps the most famous Kiwi of them all, Sir Edmund Hillary. Sir Edmund Hillary has expedition clothing brands named after him, outdoor gear named after this pioneering Kiwi, and it's little surprise as to why. Edmund Hillary was the very first person to summit Mount Everest, the first man to stand, quite literally, at the top of the world. A man who has inspired countless other explorers and mountain climbers to test their limits and achieve what was once considered unachievable. And his story started in Auckland. Hillary was born in 1919 to Percival and Gertrude Hillary. His mum was a school teacher. His dad was the editor of a regional newspaper, the North Auckland Times, and the weekly Tuakau District News, the monthly New Zealand Honeybee magazine as well. In fact, Edmund shared his father's passion for beekeeping and actually deserted his studies in maths and science at Auckland University College to return home and help his dad with his family's bees. It was already becoming clear that Ed, as his family knew him, was more of an outdoorsy sort of guy than a lecture hall-loving, quadratic equation-busting, periodic table recounting academic. And bees would prove important in Ed's early adulthood, as beekeeping was considered a reserved occupation during the Second World War. And as his family were committed followers of the religious pacifist movement Radiant Living, Edmund spent the early years of the war exempt from conscription. Later in the war, he would join the Royal New Zealand Air Force, during which time he was posted to Fiji and the Solomon Islands as a flying boat navigator. So back to climbing. Edmund's fascination with mountains and climbing started to grow when he was 16 years old, on a school trip to Mount Ruapehu in the heart of the North Island. It wasn't until he was 20 years old in 1939 that he tackled his first peak, Mount Olivier, which sounds proud at 1933 meters in the Sealy Range of the Southern Alps in the Canterbury region of New Zealand. So that was 1939, 1,933 meters above sea level, 6,916 meters below the peak of Everest. But the journey had begun. At the end of the 1940s, Hillary tackled his first of several ascents to the peak of Mount Cook, and on a subsequent trip to Europe, casually topped the 4,158 meter high Jungfrau in the Swiss Alps. The peaks were rising, but it wasn't until the 1950s, a decade and a bit into his climbing career, that Edmund hit through the 6,000 meter mark. The peak of Everest caps out at 8,849 meters. And enough people now thought that Edmund Hillary was worth a shot. In 1953, Edmund Hillary and George Low were invited to join John Hunt's British Everest expedition. Well, we all know how that ended. 400 people attempted to climb Everest that year. Only 2 people made it to the summit: Edmund Hillary and his climbing partner, the experienced Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. New Zealand went wild about the achievement, as did much of the world. It was front-page news all over the place. The Auckland Star proclaimed, "New Zealander climbs Everest." The San Francisco Chronicle had a freshly crowned Queen Elizabeth sharing the front page as British expedition finally conquers Mount Everest. As did the Newcastle Journal, which gave Edmund Hillary's pioneering achievement the top headline, relegating the Queen's coronation to the subline. It just goes to show the fervour and excitement around this monumental achievement. And do you know what Edmund himself said after the climb was over? "In some ways, I epitomise the average New Zealander. I have modest abilities, I combine these with a good deal of determination, and I rather like to succeed." I think it'll be fun to revisit the time. Let's hear from the man himself, back in 1953, when he returned home from the top of the world.
Auckland sees the end of an epic journey to and from the top of the world, and a crowd of thousands waits to welcome New Zealand's heroes. From aboard the Solent flying boat, Sir Edmund Hillary and George Low emerged to report all's well to the men and women who in spirit were never far behind them. Fellow alpinists and many others struggled for a foothold, and none was prouder of the hero than his nephew John. This was not the civic welcome, but a truly spontaneous greeting by his admirers and friends. All the excuse they needed was they were fellow New Zealanders. As George Low spoke his piece, he was watched with pride by Hillary's parents and Sir John Allen, Mayor of Auckland. And did their listeners give them a hand? In his hometown, Papakura, Hillary was greeted not only by the mayor, but by the town's school children who had been given a special half holiday. Following one more civic reception was reunion with his family, and none more pleased to see him than his brother Rex.
What do you consider were the highlights of your trip to Everest?
Well, I suppose the main highlights were the actual bits on the mountain itself. The icefall, perhaps, was the most interesting thing. We were nervous a good deal of the time, and some of the bits of ice hanging overhead, so it made a rather keen impression on us. And with me especially, I think the last summit effort from the South Col to the top, naturally I'll remember for some time.
Yes. What about that rock step? It was fairly steep, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. I was a bit worried about it at first and thought that we wouldn't get up it. But fortunately there was a crack between the ice and the rock. I got into this and I was able to wriggle my way up it.
Yes. And you had to use your spikes and handholds, what you could find, did you?
Yes, I used the spikes on my boots on the ice behind me and just held onto any old handhold I could find on the rock in front.
Yes. And I believe George Lowe did a very fine job.
Yes, George did extremely well. He did a jolly good job on the Lhotse face, which ranges from about 22 to 25,000 feet. And really he was meant to have been washed out on that, but he wouldn't remain done in, and later on he carried the highest camp up to nearly 28,000 feet.
And he put in a phenomenal time on the Lhotse face, didn't he, at that height?
Yes, he was there for nearly 9 days, and I think that's probably the longest time anybody's ever spent at that height.
Yes. Now, after climbing Everest, what are your impressions of the New Zealand mountains?
Well, I still think the New Zealand mountains are extremely fine ones. In fact, we have wonderful mountains here. They have so much snow and ice on them that they give wonderful training for the Himalayas. And weather here is so bad that we have to be extremely careful with our climbing. And just as we on Everest took every care and consideration with the result that we had no casualties at all, I think in the New Zealand Alps you have to use very sound judgment and a considerable amount of care in our very difficult conditions.
What an enthusiastic interviewer. The Kiwi appetite for outdoor pursuits and adventure is probably to be expected, as the country is as geographically exciting as it is, with mountains, volcanoes, white water rapids, magnificent fjords, not that we're going to be visiting them, inspirational hiking tracks, and a survival instinct trained by centuries of earthquakes and isolation. New Zealand has brought the world many firsts. In 1884, William Attack from Canterbury was the first person to referee a sports game with a whistle. He couldn't understand why the others would shout and exhaust their voices for the duration of a rugby game. It just took one smart cookie, or smart Kiwi, to see a better way, and the rest of the world swiftly followed suit. And on the 31st of March 1903, New Zealand farmer and inventor Richard Pearce was the first human to take flight in a motorized flying machine. The rest of the world will tell you that it was the Wright brothers, but that is not the case. 9 months separate Richard Pearce's 140-meter flight in his bamboo and scrap metal machine and the Wright brothers' famous first flirtation with the skies. Richard Pearce was something of a recluse, nicknamed Mad Pearce or Bamboo Dick, for reasons that will shortly become apparent. Richard almost never made it into the annals of aviation history. Unlike the Wright brothers in North Carolina, Richard didn't have a team of engineers working for him, nor did he enjoy the government funding provided by the US government to propel him into the sky. Richard Pearce had a farm and an obsession. The introspective dreamer who played the cello in his family's orchestra. He was the fourth of 9 children, so they had enough to form their own big band. Was fascinated by engineering and physics at school. By the time he left school, Richard already had a number of inventions under his belt. He designed and made a mechanical needle threader for his mother and a homemade zoetrope for his sisters. Richard desperately wanted to continue his studies in engineering at Canterbury College, but unable to afford that, his family gave him use of a nearby 100-acre farm instead. Farming wasn't Richard's calling in life, and the following 13 years fueled his obsession with human flight instead. In a makeshift workshop behind a wild and overgrown hedge, Richard started creating. He made his own lathe and forge, fashioned from cast-offs found around a public tip, and spent less and less time tending to his farm and more time tinkering with his creations. Richard was the number 8 wire personified. He invented a bamboo frame bicycle, which he patented in 1902, and New Zealand's first ever motorbike. But by this time, Richard's visions were already in the clouds. He started exploring the idea of powered flight in 1899, and in just 4 years, he took off. Cecil Wood, the first New Zealander to build an internal combustion engine, provided Richard with the engine with which he would drive his propeller. And with that, Richard set out to adapt a car engine into something adaptable for flight. Now, these days, anyone who lives close to a flight path knows that planes can be pretty noisy machines. But back at the turn of the 20th century, nobody knew that man could fly. After all, the prevailing thought of the day remained, if God had wanted man to fly, he would have given us wings. Well, when Richard finally got his 2-cylinder, 25-horsepower petrol engine to roar into action, it was so blisteringly loud that nearby cattle scarpered in fear. And one local farmer reported his fear that the Boer War had come to New Zealand. Set atop a repurposed tricycle, Richard's specially adapted 57-kilogram engine, a quarter of the weight of a car engine at the time, was mounted onto a bamboo, steel, wire and canvas frame with a 25-foot wingspan. Richard Pearce, or Bamboo Dick, had designed a vehicle way out of its time. A plane that bears a greater resemblance to today's microlight aircraft than the Wright brothers' bi-wing creation. And it took off. Not for long, but on 31st of March 1903, Bamboo Dick was airborne for somewhere between 100 to 150 meters. The craft crash-landed in a hedge due to insufficient control. But Richard Pearce proved something big that day. Well, maybe he proved more than one thing. First, he proved that humans can fly. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he proved that whoever you are and whatever resources you have available to you, with a sufficient commitment and dedication, you can achieve whatever you dream you set out to make true. Pearce himself, as modest as other pioneering Kiwis, even wrote to the local newspaper to explain that he felt the Wright brothers deserved the recognition for the first human flight, and not himself. But just look at the planes today. They are far closer to the design of Pearce's bamboo single-wing design, mounted on wheels with a propeller at the front, than the Wright brothers' rear propulsion skid-mounted biplanes. Perhaps it was best put by Vaughan Yarwood in the New Zealand Geographic. The Wright brothers got the recognition, Pearce the legacy. Now, there's a common theme here with inventors in New Zealand, and I don't know if you've spotted it already. Apart from the love of the outdoors, none of these pioneers would have called themselves a pioneer. Edmund Hillary was a beekeeper and an Air Force pilot with a passion for climbing. William Attack, a pioneer who changed the way almost every sport is refereed. He wasn't a professional referee. He was a reporter for the Littleton Times, went on to become the general manager of the United Press Association. And the inventor of the world's first successful flying machine wasn't an aeronautical engineer. He was a farmer who played the cello in his family's orchestra. Innovations come from passion, from hobbyists, from amateurs, real people doing what they love for the love of doing it. And New Zealand loves the extreme. Enter A.J. Hackett. Now, if there was ever an adrenaline junkie, A.J. Hackett was it. Back in the 1980s, Hackett was running a struggling ski shop, but he had other ideas on his mind. Other ideas inspired by his trip to Vanuatu, Pentecost Island. Would you like to see what Hackett saw? And I'm going to warn you, this is quite scary to watch. Look at the top left. And close your eyes about now. That's called land diving. Locals climb up a skeletal wooden tower, tie natural vines to their ankles, and hurl themselves off makeshift platforms, diving to the ground below. If it goes well, the man, for it is always a man that performs this ritual in Vanuatu, is saved from colliding with the earth by the perfectly measured vine rope, which whips him out of the way. A successful dive brings with it the promise of a good harvest and reaffirms the diver's macho credentials. The dives don't always go well. But A.J. Hackett couldn't get the scene out of his head, and he was desperate to bring this tribal ritual to the world, perhaps even in a more extreme form. As you may have guessed already, A.J. Hackett from South Auckland invented bungee jumping. But in a way, Hackett did more than that. He put New Zealand on the adventure tourism map, and he turned the country into the adrenaline backyard that it is today. You see, before Hackett's bungee jump, New Zealand was considered to be beautiful but boring by younger, thrill-seeking travellers. Well, that is certainly not the case now. Hackett first started experimenting with his friend Chris Skillcow, and they used latex rubber, climbing equipment, and parachute harnesses. And good luck. They had no backup systems, no safety nets. They were quite literally flying by the seat of their pants. Their first jump was 19 meters, and to decide who would take the leap first, they drew straws. The jump was a success, and the development continued to create the super stretchy elastic bungee cord in use by daredevils around the world today. But Hackett, coming from New Zealand, the as of yet overlooked adventure nation hidden at the edge of the world, knew that he needed to make a bit of a splash if his big idea was going to get noticed. So he went to France. Paris, in fact. Well, somewhere very particular in Paris. Hackett took a visit to the Eiffel Tower, a somewhat extended visit. You see, Hackett visited the Eiffel Tower as a regular tourist on the 25th of June, 1987, with a team of 12 friends. They all hid from the guards and were able to remain undetected through the night, setting up a bungee jump that would set the adventure world alight. At dawn on the next morning, June the 16th, Hackett jumped, and the world went wild.
AJ, do you think that now you're going to have problems with the French police?
No, I don't think so. I think they're really quite reasonable people, and I'm sure they'll see it as an inspiration for the people of Paris and France and the world.
Well, Hackett was arrested. But he wasn't detained for long. The media hype around the jump was just too loud. Nobody wanted to see Hackett in prison. They wanted him back in New Zealand, where he was about to open the world's first commercial bungee jump from Kawarau Gorge Suspension Bridge near Queenstown. 28 people braved the 43-metre jump on opening day. And since then, more than 3 million bungee jumpers have launched themselves off platforms around the world, putting their lives in the hand of a precisely engineered elastic band. New Zealand's fearless pioneers have scaled mountains and taken flight, and then taught the world how to fall from it, just for fun. There's a unique zest for life, passion in pushing the boundaries, and an ingenious in the face of adversity that seems to thrive in this special nation on the edge of the world. Thank you.